So, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to the first of the Fin sessions here in the Insight Theatre. It's probably going to come as a bit of a surprise to you, but as an industry, we're kind of interested in this Brexit idea. And I don't know if you've been under a rock for the last 2 years, you won't know what we're talking about, but for the rest of us, there's agony, there's division, there's split. And what a great opportunity we've got today to have with us Nicky Morgan, who MP and has been chair of the Treasury Select Committee since the 2017 general election. She previously served as Minister for Women and Equalities and as Secretary of State for Education under David Cameron. She was a keen Remainer, and after Cameron's resignation and Theresa May took over as Prime Minister, I think it's fair to say there was a tiny little bit of ruffling, yeah. And we're not going to talk about shoes, right. And after that, Nicky was out of the cabinet. But after the 2017 election, she was voted to this select committee role. In May 2018, she joined Nick Clegg and David Miliband, calling for a soft Brexit. And on BBC's Question Time argued that Brexiteers are doing an enormous disservice to the country. I think, to put into perspective where we are in our industry, it's a great opportunity to hear what's going on in politics and where we're going to get with it. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome to the lectern Nicky Morgan.
Very much. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for that very kind introduction. It's very nice to be here today, and thank you very much to everyone at Farnborough and to the ADS who have organised for the Treasury Select Committee to hold one of our sessions. We've just come from quizzing the members of the Financial Policy Committee, including the Governor of the Bank of England this morning, and we've been really looking forward to our short escape from Westminster and the chance to watch tailspins of a different and hopefully more enjoyable sort. But I fear we aren't going to get any escape from Brexit here today, and perhaps we shouldn't, because it is the most important issue facing this country and our political system and our businesses at this time. And of course, it's hard to think of a sector that has more of a stake in the outcome of the Brexit negotiations than the aerospace sector. Over the past 2 decades, your industry in the EU has benefited enormously from the development of common rules and a common regulator. These arrangements have facilitated aircraft production, enabling smaller firms to become part of pan-European supply chains and larger ones to achieve continent-wide economies of scale. And I know, just from my own constituency of Loughborough in the Midlands, just how important those smaller companies in the supply chain are to our local economies. In fact, I was visiting one just on Friday who employ 180 people, which to some of you will seem like perhaps a very small number, but to constituencies like mine, actually, that's a fairly sizable employer, and I want to see them continue to succeed. And of course, the aerospace sector has created tens of thousands of jobs across the country, and that's what we want to see continue. Now, of course, those rules I was talking about, those EU rules, have improved standards of safety while reducing the compliance costs of dealing with multiple national regulators. And they've enabled companies to operate freely within the European Union on a level playing field, greatly increasing choice and competition for consumers. Now, the reliance of this sector on this shared regulatory framework, underpinned by common institutions, means that the consequences of a no-deal Brexit are extremely serious, and it's something that we have just been discussing upstairs in our select committee session. But thanks to the interventions, the candid interventions by Airbus and by others, we are familiar now with what the details of a no-deal Brexit could mean. Because in short, in a no-deal scenario, we won't need to go to shows like this to see hundreds of grounded aircraft. So I know that the white paper proposals published last week for a common rule book and membership of EASA gives some reassurance that government understands what the industry requires. Now look, while the final destination remains uncertain, it is good for passengers to know 2 years after takeoff where the pilot at least intends to land. Now, since the referendum, the Treasury Committee has looked closely at the economic consequences of Brexit. And we recognise the profound impact on highly regulated sectors such as chemicals, medicines, and of course aerospace. And as I say, on the agenda for the committee today was another highly regulated sector, financial services. Now, of course, on the face of it, financial services might feel like, to this audience, a rather second-order consideration for a sector like aerospace that could be brought to a standstill if the Brexit negotiations break down. But of course, the two are closely intertwined. I have no doubt that the deals made here this week in Farnborough will be competitively priced, but planes are not cheap. The cost of the aircraft in the order books of Airbus and Boeing alone exceed €1 trillion. Financing those purchases will require deep and liquid capital markets and a thriving commercial banking sector. And nowhere does that more effectively and efficiently than our own City of London. If the activity and expertise that gives the city its world-leading edge becomes fragmented, the cost of raising finance for aircraft will rise. And already tight margins will be further squeezed. Competitiveness will fall, and ultimately airfares for ordinary people will rise. So the committee this morning was asking the Bank of England's Financial Policy Committee what the consequences or loss of existing rights of the EU market access might be, and what the city can do to retain its status as the leading place to raise finance. More pressingly still, a no-deal Brexit raises questions about contractual continuity. Now, leasing has of course become an increasingly popular way of operating aircraft. Both sides of these deals need certainty that their contracts can continue to function and be serviced, come what may, on and after the 29th of March 2019. So the committee that I chair is also scrutinising the contingency arrangements that the Bank and the Treasury have put in place to preserve contractual continuity. The 2008 financial crisis showed in calamitous fashion how financial services are intertwined with the real economy. It was out of the ashes of that crisis that a new regulatory framework was created, consisting of the Financial Policy Committee we heard from this morning, who are charged with monitoring and mitigating system-wide financial stability risks. In identifying and responding to the risks of Brexit, the Financial Policy Committee faces perhaps its most important test since its creation. And the committee will continue to scrutinise its work as it did today, and we will continue to work to ensure that financial services continue to support the real economy, the economy that is driven by innovation, ingenuity and inspiration, as we see all around us today. I'd like to thank you very much indeed for being here, for listening, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicky. Nicky, I'd like to just actually ask you a question, because like a lot of people in this room, we see this from the outside. We see it on our TV reports. We see is it really as disjointed as it looks? I mean, I kind of have this hope that somewhere along the line someone will see sense on the sort of figures you're talking about on the business. Are we right to be optimistic that we are going to be able to carry on doing business this time next year?
Well, I think it's a really good question. I mean, undoubtedly, it always looks, I think anything looks more chaotic from the outside. And I think what you're seeing very much is a clash between politics and business, for example. And I spend a lot of my time in city meetings with financial services, and I often say that if we left it to business to negotiate Brexit, I suspect that you'd have done it all much more quickly and much more cleanly. But the difficulty is we do have politics overlaid on it. And we had a popular vote in which 17 million people voted one way and 16 million people voted another. And of course, millions didn't exercise their vote at all. So trying to balance all of those competing demands, I think, is what can make it look rather more chaotic than you'd have in any business deal. And of course, it is a negotiation. So it's not just, and I think we spent an awful lot of time in this country negotiating with ourselves rather than negotiating with the EU 27, who have adopted a remarkably unified position. I mean, I'm still an optimist. I'm very much a glass half full person. I think that in this country and this particular sector, we see, as I said, ingenuity, innovation, inspiration. So I think there are good grounds to be optimistic, but there are some fundamentals that have got to be ironed out and fairly swiftly. So as we were exploring upstairs, for example, different sector, but things like derivatives contracts, actually that is something that the Bank of England, the governor was very clear, the private sector doesn't have the time, doesn't have the capacity to sort that out. So governments will need to pass rules to ensure that contracts get moved over. And I strongly suspect that actually, in terms of the aerospace sector, that's the same. There will be moments when the governments will have to step up to the plate, or the government and the commission, and that's what you want to see. I think that will happen. But as ever, anybody who's ever been involved in a commercial negotiation, and I'm a commercial corporate lawyer by background, it is an unwritten rule that all negotiations have to go right up to the wire. They have to involve all-night sessions, and everybody has to think at least 10 times, this is never going to happen, and then it does. And I very much hope and expect that that's what's going to happen this time.
Now, Tom Enders from Airbus took a little bit of flack when he spoke at the ADS dinner this year, when he made his first points about the concerns Airbus has of Brexit. Should other companies who have those concerns be going public, if they're international businesses as well as British businesses, or should we just shut up and wait?
No, you absolutely shouldn't shut up and wait. I mean, I think that the Airbus intervention was pivotal. It was really, really important. And I think, though, as I said before, Brexit it matters. That's why it's causing, you mentioned the word agony, and it does feel rather agonising in Westminster at times at the moment, but it matters. It really matters for Britain's place in the world. And this is, you look around Farnborough, this is a massively global sector where people are very interconnected, the supply chains, everything else. And I think what Airbus did was it spoke at a number of levels. I think Greg Clark could be making, the business secretary, be making these points privately, but the importance of a really large, successful company employing, as I say, I think about 14,000 people in this country, going public was very important. So it spoke to government, to ministers, reminded them of their obligations to business and to the economy. It spoke to the employees, I think some of whom had not perhaps been aware of some of the difficult decisions that bosses and businesses were going to have to take. I think it spoke to the wider public as well. And actually, regardless of what people said 2 years ago about experts, I think there is nothing that speaks so loudly as a person from frontline business, or in my old job it was frontline education, but let's say frontline business now, who cuts through to people in a way that politicians just can't, because of course I would say that because I've got this view, and so would say that because they've got that view. And I want to salute Airbus and others who have spoken up. I think that those interventions have been really critical. I know it's difficult. I know it involves saying things that might be uncomfortable for employees and for customers. But if you don't speak up now, and then you end up with a deal that does not work, and it's other sectors as well, then the opportunity is lost.
Okay. I'd like to take questions from the floor, please. Down here, thank you.
Hi, my name is Saim Said. I'm a reporter at Politico in Brussels. My question is, do you think Airbus and other companies ought to be satisfied with what was presented in the Brexit white paper? Do they still have much to worry about, or problem solved?
Well, look, I think I can't speak for individual companies. I know, for example, that Toyota, who are based near my constituency, have put out a statement welcoming much of what was in the white paper. I think the white paper was an important step in the right direction, where the government clearly and the cabinet chose to listen to what business had been saying, particularly things it was great to see in the summit communique, the point about the just-in-time supply chains, for example, and the integrated supply chains across the continent of Europe. And also I think a recognition, again very relevant I think for aerospace, about the importance of being part of agencies like EASA. But of course there are details, and it's a negotiation, there are details still to be ironed out. So I would be surprised if anybody said they got everything they wanted in that white paper. And that's the whole point about Brexit. It involves compromises and trade-offs, and I don't think that actually that's been set out quite as clearly. The Prime Minister did, in her Mansion House speech, I think used that word, compromises, but all that has not been set out as clearly as it could have been in the course of the last 18 months to 2 years, and that's what we're now seeing very much playing out on the national and international stage. But I think as far as manufacturers of goods are concerned, it was I think it was a very strong step in the right direction.
Any more questions at all?
A shy audience.
Yeah. Well, if only appearing before a select committee was as easy as this, that'd be great.
There's a hand over here. There we are.
Hi, Stephen Ollier. I'm actually based in Derby, so we're near neighbours,
Yes.
actually. And I run a small business I started 10 years ago. And Brexit's not going to hurt us a great deal, I do not think, at the moment. But I've looked at the facts. I voted to remain. But once they voted to leave, I looked at the facts. And one of the things that drives me is an £80 billion difference between what Europe exports to us and what we export to them. They export 80 billion a year more to us than we export to them. Isn't that a really powerful tool that will force them to try and find a pragmatic solution with us? I think we spend a lot of time arguing amongst ourselves, but 80 billion is a serious amount of money. I know people say, well, it's not in the context of the EU, but it is, particularly if tariffs start to be applied. So are we not actually taking a rather too negative view of the way forward? Why don't we actually face up to the facts and realise that it's probably more in Europe's interest to actually work with us almost than ourselves?
Well, that's certainly a view that's obviously put across. I think from what I hear, though, from European companies who are doing the exporting, I mean, they will find new markets if there are tariffs put up by us. And actually, in this, unlike we've seen over here, where business has had a very clear ask of government, has put their views forward, it's taken a long time to be listened to. My understanding is that a lot of European businesses, I mean, I think this is one of the fundamental differences between the way we look at the EU in this country, which is very much as a trading bloc, people to do business with, and the EU look at it very much as a political institution, a framework, and that's why we've ended up in this situation, because we have completely different expectations for the European Union. But my understanding is that a lot of EU businesses have said to their governments, you do what's right for the political future of the European Union. Don't worry about us. We will find new markets, or we'll make things work with the UK if that's what's in our interest to do. But what they're not doing is saying to EU governments, we want you to do a deal in a certain way because that's what's good for us. And so unfortunately, I just don't think that is going to be borne out. I think we will be, unfortunately, more of the losers unless we're able to end up with a more pragmatic deal along the lines of what has been proposed at Chequers. But your basic point is right. I mean, you voted one way, same way that I did. Our side didn't win the debate, so the fact is we're leaving the European Union. I think the public sentiment in this country now is, could everyone please just get on with it, which is why the frustrations at the moment in Westminster that actually the Prime Minister put on the table a sensible position to be negotiated with the EU, and I'm afraid to see people undermining that, because that doesn't deliver their version of Brexit, goes back to this point about compromise and trade-offs, I think actually does do an enormous disservice and lets down the United Kingdom in terms of our negotiating strategy.
Great. Nicky Morgan, thank you. Oh, sorry, we're going to take one last question, because I've just seen
one hand over there.
So over here, please.
It's just coming to you, so there we are. Just coming in front. There we are.
Hello, Raymond Bachin, Northern Rose Fulbright, but former Minister of Finance in Quebec. And Canada has a free trade agreement with Europe. I'm wondering, how much time are you starting to spend, and what's your view on your relations with other countries of the world, Canada and the US and others?
Well, look, it's a great question. I think that those who very much advocated for Brexit believe that there is a big wide world out there that the UK hasn't been able to explore or to conduct and agree trade agreements with because of our relationship with the EU. They've been responsible for trade policy for the last 40 years. I think it'd be fair to say that Liam Fox and his ministers spend a huge amount of time on planes, visiting different countries, working out where the potential agreements are going to be. I'm sure there are agreements out there. The issue is going to be, how long do they take to be negotiated, and what's the sort of period over which we have left being beneficiaries of the EU trade agreements before we are able to strike our own. I was in the States with the Treasury Select Committee at the end of April, and obviously we saw a little bit more of this play out last week, but the American administration were like, sure, you can have a trade agreement, it'll be on our terms, and that's the whole point. Everybody will negotiate in their own national interest. So I think the idea of there being some easy, quick wins out there is going to be difficult to see how that plays out. But of course, one of the other issues is going to be, exactly, Canada has a trade agreement now with the EU, and one of the things that's going to play out is how do we separate.
And we're a nicer country than US.
Yeah. Oh yeah, well, I have no doubt about that, and we value very much our friendship and our relationship with Canada. But how do we disentangle ourselves and take some of the parts of the current EU trade agreement that particularly work for the UK-Canadian relationship, and how do we roll that over? And I think one of the issues is going to be for our UK Parliament. We have not been scrutinising trade agreements for the last 40 plus years, and so we have got to relearn and learn a whole new way of doing that. And I think what we'll see is that trade agreements are quite political, and even when TTIP was talked about between the US and the EU, that caused enormous ructions in the UK Parliament, lots of opposition to elements of that, and I think again that's something that we are going to find as a whole new way of conducting ourselves in Parliament.
Great. Nicky, thank you very, very much for joining us this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, please show your appreciation.
Thank you.